I want to talk a little bit about abstraction and dry. You might have heard of dry, DRY, don't repeat yourself. And that's kind of a mental model for thinking about programming, where it's like you don't want to have the same chunk of code in a bunch of places. There's also an acronym called WET, which is kind of a tongue-in-cheek alternative, write everything twice. And the idea of WET is it's like you write something once, you write it again, and only after that, when you're doing it the third time, do you really feel the need to try to build an abstraction around that and prevent that duplication. It's kind of pushing back on the idea of don't repeating yourself, period, and saying sometimes it's good to repeat yourself. Now, both of these acronyms and kind of methodologies or mental models, they can work. It's not like one is right and one is wrong. Obviously, they're both really oversimplified. And ultimately, it's like if you use it right, it works fine. If you use it wrong, you can actually, by mistakenly thinking you're doing engineering according to some principle, you can actually be making your program worse. So kind of a simple example here, like say you have let's see, trying to think of a good example. So say you have a timeout in your code that is 60 seconds, right? And so somewhere in your code, you have like the number 60. And then somewhere else in your code, you have a list, say a table that you're rendering to the user, and you want that to only have 60 elements in it. So in that area of your code, you also have the number 60. They're both the same number. And technically, by writing that number in both places, you're repeating yourself, right? You're including the same number in both places. But actually, the intent and the usage of that number is totally different. So, what somebody would naively do is like write this and get yourself a variable for that number and then use that variable in both places and think that you're not repeating yourself. Obviously, for an example like this with just a simple number, it's like, well, that's stupid. The variable name is even longer than the actual number is. Why would I ever do that? I have actually seen people do this if they have like a linter where it has like a no magic numbers rule. And so they have to give every number a name, and they'll just like give it a name like this, which is meaningless, versus using the actual number. You might as well just disable the linter rule, which there's nothing wrong with that. But what people don't often realize quite as easily is when you're making functions and building modules, people will do this same thing on a bigger scale. They'll have a chunk of logic, maybe 10, maybe 100 lines, that's the same or similar in two different places, and they'll build an abstraction that separates that out and reuse that abstraction in both of those places without ever realizing that those places are only coincidentally related. They're not actually using the same underlying concepts. They're just using the same code. And that's like when you can get into a real problem with the don't repeat yourself idea. What you're not trying to do is don't repeat any code. There's nothing wrong with repeating code. What you are trying to do is not expressing the same domain concepts, the same truisms, you could say, in multiple places of your source code at a time. And again, it's not about the code, it's about what the code is expressing. And kind of another way to think about that is, if you're changing the value, will it always be changed in both places, or will it only sometimes be changed in one place and sometimes in another place? In this example where we have this 60 number, you might change the HTTP timeout, you might change the length of the rendered table, But you're never going to be changing both of those at once. They're two totally independent values, right? Obviously. But when your code gets a lot more complicated, that obviously becomes less obvious. And you might be thinking, well, this piece of database query logic, it's like it'll always be changed the same. But then maybe actually when it's used in your analytics pipeline, you should be using a different function, even if it looks the same under the hood, because you're going to need to change that more frequently. And in your transaction processing pipeline, you have exactly the same logic in a different function because you know that that's going to be changed at a different cadence. And, you're going to have to be a lot more careful about those changes versus analytics, things like that. And being aware of those meaningful differences between the usages of your functions is important when you're trying to build abstractions and to avoid overbuilding those. On the flip side, kind of the issue with the wet and the idea of not being afraid to repeat yourself is that if you express the same concept in multiple places, just thinking like, well, I don't need to make it dry, you're opening yourself up for bugs, right? People might not realize that when they're changing some piece of logic, they also have to change it in X, Y, and Z places. That's what you're kind of trying to avoid by building these abstractions.